Winter on the northern frontier has a way of swallowing sound. In the deep months when the sun hangs low like a dying ember over the white horizon, the world becomes a place of muted colors and sharper truths. That was the kind of winter settling over the valley the year the mountain men first noticed the stranger's work. A deep pit carved into the frozen earth, half hidden under a rising mound of snow. From a distance, it looked less like a dwelling and more like a mistake, a patch of disturbed land, a collapsed mine shaft, or perhaps the start of a grave. Dug hastily before the ground turned to stone. Most men preparing for winter built cabins square, familiar, reassuring. You stacked logs, cut notches, chinked the gaps, set a stove in the middle, and hoped you'd cut enough wood to feed it. That was the frontier system. That was the way of things. But the man working in the pit, silent, slow, deliberate, was doing something entirely different. He packed snow the way a mason sets stones, shaping a low dome that hardly rose 2 feet above the drifted surface. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone not experimenting, but remembering. When the others rode past, they shook their heads. "Fool idea," one trapper muttered. "Snow's cold, hole's colder. Man's making his own tomb." Another laughed. "He'll freeze dead before New Year's." But the old-timers, the ones who'd spent enough winters alone to respect anything strange that might keep a man alive, slowed their horses. They watched him work, watched the snow mound grow, and exchanged a look that said, "Either he knows something we don't, or he's completely lost his mind." In the harsh stillness of that frontier winter, no one imagined that the stupid snow pit would outperform every cabin in the valley, or that the man behind the strange design was about to rewrite what the frontier thought it knew about warmth. On the early American frontier, winter wasn't just a season, it was a judge. A season that measured the strength of a man's craft, the wisdom of his choices, and the truth of whatever he believed about survival. Every December, the mountains reminded folks that mistakes weren't lessons, they were sentences. And so over time, a kind of rigid certainty settled across the settlements and trap lines. There was only one proper way to build a winter home. You felled timber, you stacked logs, you sealed the gaps with moss and mud. You heated the space with fire. Anything outside that formula was considered either laziness or ignorance. Cabins were more than shelters. They were symbols of order in a wild and unforgiving place. A man with a cabin was a man who respected the rules of the cold. A man without one was playing games with nature, and nature never played back. That was why the stranger's snow mound stirred such unease. It wasn't simply unconventional. It was an open defiance of everything frontier wisdom insisted was true. Snow was something you shoveled, not something you lived under. Underground was where frozen ground waited, not where a man sought comfort. The older mountain men knew this logic by heart. They'd watched storms snap trees like matchsticks. They'd held friends who froze only yards from safety. They'd fed their stoves through nights so long the fire felt like the only living thing left in the world. And they believed, not out of stubbornness, but out of experience, that survival came from adding heat, not from rethinking how to keep it. So when word spread that the stranger planned to winter inside his snow-covered pit, the valley's reaction wasn't just doubt, it was fear on his behalf. They pictured the cold creeping in, inch by inch, until it wrapped around him like a burial shroud. They whispered that he was courting death. And yet, through all that concern and judgment, none of them paused to ask the simplest question, the one he had built his entire shelter upon. What if warmth wasn't something you fought for, but something you protected? He arrived in the valley quietly, long before the freeze set in. No one knew much about him, except that he carried himself with the calm of someone who'd already survived harder winters than most men ever would. His name passed from trapper to trapper, until it settled into common use, was Anernik. Though some said that wasn't his birth name, but a shortened form of something older, spoken in a tongue few in the region recognized. He wasn't a typical frontier wanderer. He wasn't restless, reckless, or running from anything. Instead, he carried an air of someone following wisdom handed down through generations. He was of northern blood, born far beyond the tree line where the world spends most of the year under snow and silence. His people had lived in lands where winter wasn't a visitor, but a sovereign ruler where warmth was never taken for granted, and where survival meant understanding the nature of cold, rather than simply trying to overpower it. While frontier settlers prided themselves on rugged independence, Anernik carried a quieter pride, one rooted in tradition, observation, and techniques refined longer than America had been a nation. When the locals watched him packing snow onto his dome, they saw a man defying logic. When he looked at them splitting enough spruce to feed 3 months of fire, he saw men fighting a losing battle against physics. In his homeland, shelter wasn't built against the cold. It was built around its rules. Snow wasn't the enemy, it was insulation. The earth wasn't a frozen void, it was a warm reservoir below the frost line. He never argued with those who mocked his design. He simply worked with steady hands, bending willow branches, packing snow, and checking the warmth of the earth with the same reverence a blacksmith gives glowing steel. Anernik wasn't building a gamble. He was building a memory one his ancestors had trusted long before cabins and chimneys became symbols of proper living. And the valley was about to learn that a man armed with ancestral knowledge is never as foolish as he looks. Frontier communities had their own unwritten laws, shaped not by government, but by the cold itself. One of the strongest among them was simple trust what has worked before. Anything that fell outside that narrow circle of tradition was met with suspicion and often with laughter, the nervous kind that comes when something challenges what people think they know. Anernik's strange project did exactly that. The trappers and prospectors who passed his work site reacted the way men often do when confronted with an idea too foreign to fit their worldview. Some chuckled and rode on. Others shook their heads, as if watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. A few even tried to warn him not out of cruelty, but out of genuine alarm. They'd spent enough nights listening to the wind scream around their cabins to know what the cold could do to a man. To them, a pit in the ground was the start of a grave. Snow was something you escaped, not embraced. The idea that it could keep you warm felt like claiming a bear's den was better than a homestead. One prospector muttered, "A man's building his own coffin." Another said, "Snow don't care how smart you are, it'll freeze you just the same." Yet beneath the ridicule lurked something deeper fear. Fear that they had spent their whole lives fighting winter the wrong way. Fear that their cabins, monuments to their labor, were not the fortresses they believed. Fear that a stranger's quiet confidence meant he understood something they did not. People mock what threatens their certainty. And nothing threatens certainty more than a man who refuses to play by its rules and still looks like he knows exactly what he's doing. But maybe the unease came from something even older, something instinctive. On the frontier, survival depended on predictability. Anernik wasn't predictable. His shelter didn't resemble anything in their experience. It unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. Little did they know, but the thing they dismissed as an ice tomb would soon prove more alive, more resilient than every log cabin in the valley combined. Long before engineers drew diagrams or scientists assigned names to natural processes, people who lived close to the land understood something essential. The earth itself holds heat. Anernik didn't learn this from a book or a chart. He learned it from generations who trusted the ground beneath their feet. On the frontier, men measured warmth by the crackle of a stove or the weight of split firewood. But Anernik measured it by the quiet rise of heat from soil untouched by winter's hand. Most settlers believed the earth froze solid clear to its core. The logic seemed simple: if the top is frozen, everything below must be colder still. But cold doesn't work that way. Winter only reaches down so far, a boundary called the frost line. In the northern interior, that line sits roughly 5 to 6 feet deep. Above it, the soil freezes into a hard shell. Below it, the earth remains unexpectedly warm, hovering around 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how brutally the wind claws at the world above. Ancestral understood this intimately. When he dug his pit 8 feet down, he wasn't searching for shelter. He was tapping into a natural heat source, a stable reservoir insulated by yards of soil. At that depth, the ground breathed out a faint, steady warmth. Not enough to make a man sweat, but enough to ensure he wouldn't freeze. Enough to turn a simple hole in the earth into a natural thermal pocket. Frontier cabins stood exposed on the surface, their floors suspended over air colder than a riverbed in December. Heat escaped downward, outward, and upward, anywhere it could run. But Anarnik's shelter captured warmth from below and prevented it from leaving above. He wasn't fighting the cold with fire. He was partnering with the earth to hold on to what heat existed. To the settlers, snow and frozen ground seemed lifeless. But to Ancestral, they were tools, walls, insulation, and a heater all in one. The earth gave him a baseline of heat. The snow would help him keep it. And that combination, though invisible to the naked eye, would soon defy every assumption the valley held about winter. Ancestral began his excavation long before the first real snap of winter, when the ground was still willing to be shaped. In late August, while others were cutting firewood and mending roofs, he worked quietly with a shovel, an adze, and a hand-carved wooden scoop. He dug with the steady discipline of someone who understood that the most important part of a winter shelter isn't the roof, it's the foundation. Every shovelful of earth removed was a direct investment in the warmth he would depend on months later. The first 3 feet were the hardest frozen surface soil locked tight from the previous winter. But below that, at 4 and 5 feet, the permafrost softened just enough to yield to his tools. By the time he reached 8 feet deep, the air at the bottom of the pit held a faint humidity and a temperature distinctly different from the biting air above. It was the quiet warmth of a world protected from winter's reach. Ancestral felt the change on his skin, subtle but undeniable. He widened the pit into a near-perfect circle, roughly 12 feet across. A round shape wasn't accidental. It offered superior strength and minimized cold corners where frost could gather. The vertical walls were trimmed neatly, not because aesthetics mattered, but because smooth walls shed moisture evenly and resisted collapse. Onto the floor, he laid a foundation of gravel for drainage, then flat stones, then a soft barrier of dried grass and moss. Finally, he split spruce planks by hand to create a clean wooden floor elevated slightly above the thermal ground. To an outsider, it looked like unnecessary work, too much effort for a shelter that would never hold heat. But that was the difference between frontier assumptions and ancestral knowledge. Ancestral wasn't digging a hole. He was carving out a vessel designed to capture every usable degree of warmth the earth offered. The settlers built walls to keep winter out. Ancestral built a space where winter couldn't reach. When he climbed out of the finished pit, brushed soil from his hands, and looked down at his work, he knew he'd already won half the battle against the cold before a single snowflake ever hit the ground. Once the pit was shaped and the floor laid, Ancestral turned his attention to the next layer of survival, the walls. Not the rugged, squared-off timbers that settlers prized, but a design far older and in many ways far smarter. He began by setting a ring of spruce logs vertically around the inside perimeter of the pit, each one trimmed and fitted with surprising precision for a man working alone in the wilderness. These weren't meant to hold weight the way cabin logs did. They served an entirely different purpose: to create a barrier, a cavity, and eventually a thermal shield. He spaced the log wall just 6 inches inside the raw earth wall. That gap, small enough to overlook, big enough to matter, was the heart of his strategy. Into it, he packed dried moss, willow leaves, and grasses gathered earlier in the season and stored carefully to keep dry. The settlers saw moss as chinking material, something you shoved between cabin logs as an afterthought. Ancestral treated it like gold. Dried moss is light, airy, and astonishingly resistant to heat loss. Each handful trapped countless pockets of still air, the very thing insulation is built upon. The wooden inner wall kept the insulation dry, preventing ground moisture from leaching into the material. The earth wall, though cool, offered natural stability and additional resistance to heat movement. Together, the system created 3 layers: earth, insulation, and wood, each with its own job, each working quietly to hold heat inside. A cabin wall, even well built, might offer an R value of 6 or 8. Ancernic's wall system, earth, buffering the outer cold, a thick blanket of natural fibers, then interior wood, had the equivalent of several times that performance. He wasn't relying on the thickness of a single material. He was stacking the strengths of multiple. People later claimed the man was lucky, but this wasn't luck. It was engineering rooted in long memory knowledge from a culture that learned to survive where trees were scarce. Temperatures were brutal, and every bit of heat had to be earned and protected. By the time the inner walls were complete, the pit no longer felt like a hole. It felt like the beginning of a fortress, quiet, humble, and far more efficient than anything the valley had built above ground. With the pit insulated and the walls finished, Ancestral turned to the most misunderstood part of his entire design, the snow dome. To frontier settlers, snow was nothing but cold weight, an enemy that collapsed roofs, buried cabins, and smothered livestock. Using it as a roof sounded like madness. But to Ancestral, snow wasn't a threat. It was a material, a building block, a natural insulator unmatched by anything a man could cut, split, or stack. He began by bending willow branches into a low curved skeleton that rose only 4 feet above the ground at its peak. The frame looked fragile, too slight to carry even a few inches of snow. But willow is flexible, and strength lies in shape as much as substance. The dome form distributes force outward instead of downward. It was the same principle used in ancient stone arches, and in the igloos of the far north, pressure becomes stability. Once the frame stood firm, he stretched 2 layers of caribou hide across it, leaving a narrow gap of air between them. This wasn't for warmth alone. It was for moisture control. Snow shelters fail when trapped moisture freezes on the interior surface, building frost and choking the space. The breathable hides allowed vapor to pass outward while retaining a surprising amount of heat. Then came the snow itself. Ancestral didn't pile it on loosely. He built it in layers 6 inches at a time, packing each layer with a carved wooden paddle until it was dense, strong, and interlocked. Over days, the dome grew 1 foot thick, then 2, then 3, and in some places, 4 feet of solid, compressed snow. Settlers passing by joked he was building his own avalanche. Ancestral just kept working. They saw snow as cold. He saw snow as millions of tiny air pockets, still air, the most perfect insulation nature offers. A 3-foot shell of packed snow has an insulating value no frontier cabin could dream of. Logs can crack. Wind can find seams. Snow, when shaped correctly, becomes a seamless thermal barrier. By the time he finished, the mound looked like nothing more than a rounded hill drifted over by the storm. But beneath that quiet white surface stood one of the most efficient roofs ever built in the wilderness light, strung, silent, and ready for the long winter ahead. Most frontier cabins relied on doors, heavy planks, hung on iron hinges built to stop wind predators and drifting snow. Ancestral shelter had no such door. Instead, he carved a sloping tunnel from the surface, down to the base of his pit, an entrance that seemed to make no sense to the men who watched him work. Why crawl on your hands and knees like an animal when you could simply walk inside like a civilized man? But the tunnel wasn't a compromise. It was a calculation, one rooted in the physics of air itself. Cold air is heavier than warm air. It sinks, it pools, it moves like water poured into a bowl. Ancestral shaped his entrance to take advantage of that truth. The tunnel sloped downward for 8 feet, then opened into the living space slightly below the height of his floor. That meant any cold air slipping in from the outside would settle into the tunnel first, unable to climb up into the warmer main room. Instead of letting the cold invade, he trapped it in its own pocket far from where he slept or worked. This simple principle, known now as thermal stratification, was something the northern peoples understood long before physics texts existed. You don't fight cold air. You guide it. You let it pool where it cannot cause harm. Ancestral treated cold not as an enemy to battle, but as a force to be channeled. At the tunnel's outer end, he hung a flexible curtain of caribou hide. It wasn't airtight. It didn't need to be. It acted as a baffle slowing wind and controlling airflow. Any small drafts that slipped in simply flowed down the tunnel and stayed there like a moat of cold air protecting the castle of warmth inside. Settlers spent their winters chasing drafts around their cabins, stuffing rags into gaps, hammering in wedges, cursing the wind that found every crack. Ancestral never had that problem. His entrance didn't fight drafts, it used gravity to lock them out. It was one more quiet reminder that survival isn't always about adding more heat. Sometimes it's about letting the cold go exactly where it wants, just not where you are. Inside the finished shelter, the space was humble, 8 feet across, with a ceiling just high enough for a man to sit upright without brushing the dome above. No framed windows, no iron stove, no stack of split wood waiting to be fed into a fire that never slept. To most settlers, it would have looked bare, maybe even bleak. But to Ancestral, the simplicity wasn't a limitation. It was a design choice rooted in the understanding that a smaller space meant less heat lost, less heat needed, and less energy spent staying alive. Along the curved wall, he built a raised sleeping platform from split spruce logs, stacked just high enough to lift him above the coldest air that might settle on the floor. The platform wasn't large, but it was steady and level, designed the way his ancestors had built sleeping benches for generations. On top, he arranged several layers of caribou hide, soft side up, fur side down, creating a bed that retained heat from his body long after he lay down. Near the platform sat the heart of his living space, a small stone niche where he could warm food or melt snow using nothing more than a tiny oil lamp. The lamp might have seemed insignificant, its flame no larger than a child's thumb, but in a space so well insulated, its heat carried weight. 100 BTUs an hour meant little in a drafty cabin. Down here, it mattered. Down here, every small contribution of warmth added to the quiet reservoir held within the snow and earth. There was no clutter, no furniture built for display. Everything inside served a purpose. A woven pack for supplies, a stone bowl for melting snow, a bone needle and sinew for repairing clothing. Ancestral knew that a winter shelter wasn't measured by how much it contained, but by how little it needed. The less a man depended on, the less could fail him. In that small circular room, dimly lit, insulated by nature, warmed by the earth, there was a kind of calm no cabin could offer. Outside, winter howled. Inside, it didn't matter. The space was steady, predictable, and safe. And in the frontier world, safety born from simplicity was a rare luxury indeed. By mid-November, the valley had taken on the gray-blue stillness that always preceded the first true cold snap. Frost clung to every branch, every cabin roof, every breath that left a man's lungs. The settlers had begun their winter routines, feeding fires, patching gaps, hauling wood, each preparing for the long months when warmth was something you chased often without catching it. And while they worked, Ancestral moved into his shelter. No ceremony, no announcement. He simply carried his small bundle of belongings down the tunnel and disappeared beneath the snow. That first night, the temperature outside hovered around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the dome, with only his body heat and the steady flicker of his oil lamp, the air climbed to a surprising 42 degrees. Not balmy, but undeniably comfortable for a man used to northern winters. Ancestral slept deeply wrapped in a single caribou hide, while above him, the wind scraped across the snow dome without finding a way in. Word spread quickly. Curiosity, after all, is stronger than doubt. One man, Robert, a trapper, whose cabin stood half a mile away, couldn't resist the pull of finding out whether the snow tomb had already claimed its victim. He trudged across the frozen ground, expecting misery, shivering maybe even frostbite. Instead, he found Ancestral kneeling by the stone niche, repairing a fishing net with steady, unhurried hands. "By God," Robert muttered, ducking into the room. "It's warm." He pulled out his pocket thermometer, a tool prized among trappers for judging weather and animal behavior. After a moment, the slender needle settled at 45 degrees Fahrenheit.
Breathable membrane allows vapor to
Robert
pass
blinked.
through, preventing
He checked
condensation
again.
from building inside the
Same
shelter.
reading. "Impossible," he whispered. But the warmth wasn't magic. It was math. The earth below offered its steady 38-degree baseline. The snow dome prevented escape. Ancestral own presence raised the temperature a few degrees more. Frontiermen always believed warmth came only from flames. Ancestral was proving night by night that warmth could also come from understanding. By late December, the valley had hardened into the kind of cold that only northern frontiers truly understand. The kind that doesn't sting or bite, but settles like iron around everything it touches. The rivers locked solid. Smoke from cabin chimneys no longer rose, but hung motionless in the air, frozen in place. Every sound, an axe strike, a dog's bark, a footstep, seemed muted, swallowed by the weight of the cold itself. It was during this brutal stretch that winter made its move. Temperatures fell to 30 below, then 40, then 50 below zero. The kind of cold that kills livestock, shatters tools, and forces even the toughest mountain men to admit that no one really conquers winter. They only negotiate with it. Cabins across the valley became battlegrounds. Men threw log after log into their stoves, feeding fires that roared like beasts, yet still lost ground to drafts, sneaking through the smallest cracks. Floors turned to ice. Frost crawled across doorframes. Some burned through 3 cords of wood a week and still had to sleep in coats. A few grew pale and hollow-eyed, waking every hour to feed their stoves in fear the fire would die. Robert, the skeptical trapper, thought often of Ancestral during those nights. He pictured the man lying frozen at the bottom of his snow pit, entombed by his own stubbornness. After nearly a week of the relentless cold, worry gnawed at him enough to act. One morning, wrapped in every layer he owned, he trudged through waist-deep snow toward the rounded mound, barely visible through the storm haze. He expected silence. Instead, he saw a thin ribbon of vapor rising from a small vent pipe, steady, calm, almost casual, as if the shelter beneath were simply exhaling. Heart pounding, he ducked through the tunnel. The temperature shift hit him halfway down. At the entrance, the air was sharp as broken glass. 10 feet in it softened. When he stepped into the chamber, he froze not from the cold, but from disbelief. Ancestral lay sleeping under a single fir, breathing slow and steady. The thermometer in Robert's hand soon revealed the truth: 42 degrees inside, minus 50 outside. The impossible was happening, and it was warm. Robert stood there longer than he meant to, holding his breath, as if any sound might break the fragile spell of warmth around him. The contrast was unreal. Outside, winter punished every exposed inch of skin. Inside, the air felt mild, stable, almost gentle. Anernik stirred, blinked up at him, and gave a small, sleepy smile, the kind a man gives when waking from a good rest, not from a night spent wrestling death. "You came to check if I was frozen," he said softly. There was no pride in his voice, no challenge. Just quiet certainty. Robert didn't bother to deny it. How? How are you still comfortable in this? My cabin's fighting for its life." His voice cracked, not from cold, but from the unraveling of a belief he'd held his entire life. Anernik sat up, pulled on his boots, and gestured for Robert to sit. "You heat from fire," he said. "I heat from the earth, from my body, from a lamp. But more important, I keep the heat I already have." Robert frowned. "But heat rises. It escapes. Every cabin fights that." Anernik nodded. "Cabins sit in cold air, thin walls, cracks, wind. Heat leaks everywhere. Your fire works hard, but it fights too many enemies." He placed a hand on the packed snow dome above him. Snow doesn't let heat go. It traps it, like many small hands holding it in place. Robert thought of his own cabin, the way the stove roared, but the corners stayed cold, how the floor seemed to suck warmth from his feet, how the wind found every weakness. He suddenly saw it differently, not a home keeping out the cold, but a leaking box draining precious heat into the night. "So you're not staying warm by making more heat," Robert whispered. "You're staying warm by losing almost none of it." Anernik smiled. "Yes. You make river of heat and try to stop it from flowing away. I make a pond of heat that doesn't move." In that moment, something shifted in Robert. Not just understanding, but respect. The man he once thought stubborn or foolish now seemed like someone who had mastered a language of winter the frontier had forgotten. And for the first time in weeks, Robert felt a different kind of warmth, one born not from fire, but from clarity. Robert wasn't a scientist. Few frontier men were. But he had the one skill that mattered out here. He paid attention. And as Anernik explained the workings of the shelter, each idea landed with the weight of something simple, obvious, something Robert could not believe he'd never noticed before. The brilliance wasn't in complexity. It was in understanding how nature behaved when no one was looking. Anernik began with the foundation. 8 feet down, he said the earth is always above freezing. 35 to 40 degrees. Always. Even when the sky is colder than death. He pressed a hand to the wooden inner wall. The earth is not trying to freeze you. It is trying to warm you. But a cabin lets that warmth escape into the cold air beneath its floor. Robert pictured the crawl space under his own cabin. Dark, drafty, filled with air, colder than a riverbed in January. He'd never thought of it as stealing heat, but now he understood that was exactly what it did. His stove fought the cold outside, below, and all around. Anernik's pit fought almost nothing, most. Then came the snow dome. Anernik explained that snow wasn't frozen water, the way settlers believed it was trapped air held by tiny crystalline structures. Still air, he emphasized, is one of the best insulators on Earth. 3 feet of packed snow, he said, has more insulation than your cabin wall by 20 times. Robert felt almost foolish. Every winter he had cursed snow for burying his roof and swallowing his fences. Never once had he considered that the thing he fought hardest could be the very thing built to save him. Anernik continued, "My lamp gives maybe 100 BTUs each hour. My body gives more. Together maybe 10,000 BTUs per day. In your cabin, that heat disappears. In this shelter, it stays. I only need to raise the temperature 10 degrees from earth warmth to comfort. You must raise it 100. Raise it 1. There it was, the math, the logic, the truth that frontier tradition had buried under years of chopping wood and feeding fires. Anernik had not created warmth out of nothing. He had simply stopped it from slipping away. And for Robert, the realization felt like watching the world tilt into place. Everything finally made sense. Beautiful, humbling sense. In the days that followed, Robert couldn't shake the comparison forming in his mind. Every time he returned to his cabin, he saw it differently, as if Anernick's shelter had quietly peeled away a layer of illusion. What once felt sturdy and dependable now seemed fragile, wasteful, and strangely loud. His stove thundered, the wind hissed through gaps he could never fully seal, and the cold crawled across the floor like a living thing. Even when the room reached 55 or 60 degrees, comfort felt temporary, conditional, something bought with constant labor. He started taking notes, something he'd never done before. One page listed how often he fed the stove. Another showed how much wood he burned a cord and a half per week in moderate cold, more when the temperature dipped lower. He calculated his total for the season: 40 to 50 cords, each one cut, split, hauled, and stacked by hand. The labor itself was a second winter hidden behind the first. Then he compared it to Anernick. No cords of firewood, no midnight feedings of the stove, no risk of a chimney flaring or of waking to a dead fire and frostbitten fingers. 10 gallons of oil, a small flame, a bed of hides. Earth warmth doing what no amount of chopped spruce could match. But the real difference wasn't fuel. It was feeling. Robert's cabin was full of temperature swings. Near the stove, he'd sweat. Step away and the cold wrapped around him again. His feet were always cold, his shoulders always tense. The space carried a constant threat. If the fire dies, so do you. Inside, the snow pit temperature barely changed. No hot zones, no cold corners, just steady, quiet warmth. And more than that, peace. Anernick could sleep through the night without fear. He didn't battle his shelter, he lived within it. It struck Robert that the frontier had taught men to worship size bigger cabins, larger stoves, taller stacks of wood. But Anernick had chosen efficiency over might. He showed that comfort wasn't a matter of fighting harder. It was a matter of losing less. In a land ruled by winter, that difference meant everything. By February, the cold had eased just enough for men to move more freely, and word of Anernick's astonishing winter survival had traveled far beyond the handful of cabins closest to him. What began as whispers, half disbelief, half curiosity, slowly grew into a steady stream of visitors. Trappers, prospectors, and even a few old-timers who rarely left their homes trudged through the snow to see the shelter with their own eyes. Some arrived with skepticism sharp as their axes. Others came quietly, trying not to appear too eager. But all of them shared the same question: how was this possible? Anernick welcomed them without pride or bitterness. He guided each man down the tunnel, explaining the cold trap, the snow dome, the insulated walls, the earth warmth. He answered every question patiently, sometimes repeating himself 3 or 4 times, as visitors struggled to accept what their senses were telling them. More than once, a hardened frontiersman stood inside the shelter in complete silence, gripping his coat, stunned that he didn't need it. A few dismissed the shelter immediately. Too small, they said. Too strange. Too much crawling, not enough standing. They couldn't see past the unfamiliar shape or the idea of living partly underground. Frontier pride often clung tightly to tradition, even when tradition demanded an exhausting supply of firewood and sleepless nights feeding a stove. But others, especially the men who'd spent years alone on trap lines, recognized brilliance when they saw it. These were the ones who asked the real questions: how deep should the pit be? What kind of moss worked best? How thick must the snow dome become before it strengthens rather than suffocates? In the summer that followed, 5 men asked Anernick to help them build their own versions. Each shelter reflected its owner, one slightly larger one with a steeper tunnel, another built closer to a riverbank where snow drifted deeper. None were exact copies, but all shared the same heartbeat of earth warmth, snow insulation, and a respect for natural forces that cabins too often ignored. The valley's people wouldn't abandon their log homes, not entirely. But something had changed. Anarnik's winter had cracked open a door, a quiet reminder that survival doesn't always require more effort. Sometimes it requires older wisdom. As winter loosened its grip and the first thaws carved silver veins through the snowfields, the valley slowly returned to motion. Men stepped outside without bracing their shoulders against invisible knives of wind. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals instead of frantic bursts. Life felt survivable again. Yet something deeper lingered in the minds of those who had visited the snow pit shelter. It wasn't just curiosity, it was humility. For months, Anarnik had lived in what many first mocked as a fool's chamber, a snow tomb, a mud hole, a place where a man would surely freeze or suffocate. Instead, it had become the warmest, most stable refuge in the valley. No roaring fire, no towering stack of firewood, no constant vigilance. Just understanding, calm, quiet, rooted understanding. The frontier often celebrated strength the size of a man's cabin,
42 degrees.
the weight of his axe, the height of his
Steady,
woodpile.
warm, and almost
But Anarnik
unbelievable
reminded
against the
them that
raging
survival
inside.
sometimes comes from something else entirely. From noticing how cold air sinks, how earth holds its heat, how snow, the very thing they spent their lives shoveling and cursing, could become an ally. He showed that the wilderness didn't always need to be conquered. Sometimes it needed to be listened to. Some men returned to their cabins grateful for what they had learned.
Earth warmth provides the base.
Others
It's the
returned
insulation
uneasy,
and the cold
sensing
trap
that the
design
world
working
was
together
bigger
that
and more
truly allow you
complex
to
than they had
survive and
believed.
keep this cold.
A few quietly made plans to build auxiliary pitch shelters for their trap lines the following summer, not because they wanted to copy the stranger,
So I was thinking
but
about what you
because
said
they
earlier.
had
It
seen a
makes lot of
truth
sense.
no amount of
We should
firewood could
definitely
argue
move
with.
forward the
And
plan
as for
next week.
Anernik, when the ice broke and the rivers swelled, he gathered his pack, thanked the land in a language older than the valley itself, and disappeared into the northern horizon. He left no monument behind, no written manual, just a memory of warmth held in the heart of winter. But his lesson remained echoing across time. Warmth is not won by overpowering the cold, but by refusing to lose the heat you already have. It was wisdom born long before cabins, long before settlers, long before maps gave names to these mountains. The kind of wisdom the frontier forgot, and the kind the modern world will need again.